Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 475 for the 19th of Adar in a regular year. I've entitled today's episode, The Smuggler, which is an analogy I cannot take credit for. I actually stole it. Speaking of smuggling, haha, from a very special man named Meir Abasera. Some of you may be familiar with him, familiar with his work. He was a very interesting person. He started out as being very well known in the world of macrobiotics. He was a healer. He was a speaker, a writer, a lot of different things. And eventually he came to Chabad Lubavitch and became a chassid of the Rebbe. He actually became known as the Rebbe's whistler. Yes, you heard that right. Like he whistled. So the full story behind that is a little bit too tangential to get into now. Maybe I'll talk about it more another time. But basically, one time at a Farbrengen, at a Hasidic gathering in 770 with tons and tons of people, the Rebbe motioned to him and told him to whistle. And so Meir Abasera started to whistle with his two fingers, and he made a really loud sound, and the Rebbe encouraged him to continue. And thereon, he became known as the Whistler, the Rebbe's Whistler. You can see videos of this. It's actually really quite fascinating. But to get back to the topic at hand, so Meir Abasera passed away a few years ago, actually, but one thing that he left behind is a book that he wrote, which is one of my most favorite books. I highly recommend it to everybody who likes especially very poetic writing. It's called The Possible Man, Life in the Shadow of the Just. And it is sort of like this very poetic autobiography that Meir Abasera put together around the topics of Chassidus and just using really beautiful imagery and language and everything to explain topics in Chassidus and talk about his life sort of in an autobiographical sense in a really unique way. Even the title, The Possible Man, is an allusion to the Tanya. It's an allusion to the main character of the Tanya, the Benoni that we've been learning about, otherwise known as the intermediate man. So it was sort of like Meir Abasera was saying that this Benoni is somebody that we can all possibly be. It's possible for us to do this. And Chassidus kind of gives us the tools to do that. So in the book, there is a chapter 2 called The Smuggler. And I'd actually like to just read from the book, straight from the book for you, as I think that the way that Meir Abasera explains this idea of a smuggler is really too beautiful to gloss over. And I'd love for you guys to hear it in his own words. So here we go. This is from page 33, chapter 2 of The Possible Man by Meir Abasera. So Meir Abasera writes, "My faults outnumber me. I have become so small by comparison that without all this fright, I would surely look like a mite on the track. But I consider my faults a blessing, as they assist me in diverting the attention of those who wish to do me harm. Because in truth, this train carries a priceless cargo. I have brought my faults along only to serve as a decoy, to help me make it past the frontier. Had I officially stripped myself of all my defects, it would have been impossible for me to make the slightest move. My faults serve as a camouflage. By assuming the colors of the landscape, I am able to fool the customs guards. They search my baggage but find nothing, for I have disguised my cargo as bags of stones. The guards, crisp and efficient, swagger and wink among themselves, concealing their scorn for this unkempt, unfashionable immigrant. Let the Jew take his last trip, they say, but the irony is mine. They think they are sending me off to die. In fact, I have never been so alive. With an absurd and automatic, much obliged, I move on." So that's the end of the excerpt from that book. And so you might be wondering to yourself, what does all that mean? Who is the smuggler? What is he smuggling? Where is he smuggling it to and from? Who are the guards? Why does he have to smuggle these things? So hopefully we're going to answer all of these questions in today's episode, which I think very much relates to today's Tanya. And for context, we're in the middle of chapter 35 of Likkutei Amarim, where we've been discussing the great value of the mitzvahs over and above loving God, because we described how loving God is a very subjective experience, and thus it's limited to the person themselves and limited to their emotions. And by virtue of the fact that there is a lover and that which is loved, it actually, in a weird way, kind of connotes separation between he who loves and that which is loved. Versus mitzvahs, by contrast, take away this separation. And mitzvahs really bind us to God in a way that pure love of God cannot. Now, today, the Alter Rebbe is going to get deeper into this idea of the mitzvahs and the practical aspect, the practical component of keeping the mitzvahs, and how it is that when we do mitzvahs, we need our physical bodies and our animal souls to do these mitzvahs. So if you've been following along the Tanya so far, up until now, it kind of sounds like the animal soul gets a pretty bad rap. Like we called it, that the really lowly, we really pushed it down. We said how the animal soul has the potential to be worse than an animal, it has these like really lowly desires, all kinds of things like that. But now in today's Tanya, there's going to be sort of like this switch where we're actually going to learn that not only is the animal soul not pure evil, but it actually has a very important and holy purpose to it. And it's actually essential to fulfilling the will of God. So just to give a little brief review about our animal soul, like what is the animal soul? What are souls in general? What is the makeup of a Jew? So what have we learned so far? Well, we learned about how every Jew has two souls. We have an animal soul and we have a godly soul. We learned about how our primary identification, our sense of self, our ego, our personality, all of those things is really our animal soul. That's when we think of the I, the self, all of those things. We also learned about how the godly soul, by contrast, is a gift from God. It's a part of God himself. And we learned about how these two souls have very opposing desires and wants, and how they are engaged in a perpetual battle inside of our bodies in order to gain full dominion over our bodies. And we talked about how for the Beinoni, or for those of us who are striving to be Beinonim, this war is perpetual and never ending, and the godly soul will never gain full dominion over our animal souls. And we talked about how and why this should not make us feel really depressed and despondent, because we should realize that, first of all, struggling is our purpose and there's value in the struggle itself, and that we can get a lot stronger and gain a lot through struggling and all of that. And then more recently, we've been talking about this idea that we can also and should really focus our attention towards the godly soul and not focus so much on our animal soul, and recognize the fact that we can actually nourish our godly soul that hovers above us and feed the flames of the godly soul through our good deeds and through our different actions. So that brings us to where we are now. And in order to, again, understand this whole idea of the smuggling and what we're smuggling and all of that stuff, there are a few things that we need to understand about both of these souls. So as of now, it probably sounds like the animal soul is getting a pretty bad rap and the godly soul is getting really amazing acclaims and everything like that. But we'll see in this section that it gets a little bit more complex, and that there are some limitations, believe it or not, to the godly soul, and how the animal soul is not just something that is like this annoying thing that we need to overcome and obstacle that we need to work around, but it actually serves a very, very essential purpose. So let's start off by talking about the godly soul and talking about some of its limitations. So the best way that we can really understand the godly soul is by looking at people who really embody the godly soul, who are not like the Beinoni or not like me and you, but are actually people who have succeeded in winning this war, have succeeded in having their godly soul conquer and rule over the animal soul. So otherwise known as tzaddikim. So these are men and women who are very righteous and who, as we've talked about, have succeeded in really totally squashing the power of their animal soul, and the godly soul has full dominion. So this sounds like a really amazing thing, right? Like, what could be higher than that? This is what we're all would love to be, these kind of people. So what we'll learn about in the chapter today is, yes, we don't want to take away from the holiness of these people, obviously, but what is it that makes these people so amazing and kind of defines them as being tzaddikim and really allows their godly soul to shine, is this incredible sense of love and fear that they have for God, right? So it's like, we talked about this, how it's like their entire motivation, their entire yearning, everything is just about God, God, God all the time. And there is no sense of their own needs or anything. So that sounds great. However, we already spoke about in the last couple of episodes, this is a very limited and subjective experience. It's limited to their feelings of love towards God. So now the issue with this is that when we're talking about God and we're talking about who God is, God, as we've talked about, is not only just the creator of the world and the ruler of the world and all of those things, he's actually the one exclusive reality. So when we say that there's one God and not two, and we're going to talk about this a lot more when we get further into the Tanya, but there's an exclusivity there. There's a sense that the only true reality is God. There's not me and God and you and God and all those things. There's only God. God is the only true reality. So if we want to really connect with God in a real way, any kind of feeling that we have that is our own personal feelings towards God is kind of incomplete in a certain sense. And it's not really going to allow us to connect with God in the utmost way, in a true unified way of truly being submerged and connected with him. The only way to connect with God fully, the only way to really be unified with him in a truly manifest way, is through true nullification. So it's kind of like the idea of, like, you can't pour tea into a full cup kind of thing. So it's like, if a person has a sense of self, no matter who they are, no matter how holy they are, so far as they are self-aware that they have a self-definition, by virtue of that sense of self, there's no room for God to manifest his sense of self. So this is the first issue that comes up when it comes to the godly soul. So going back to wonders of the world, or I know this is going to be a longer episode, so try to stick with it. There's going to be a lot of components to it. Hopefully everything will come together. But the godly soul, as great as it is, one of the limitations of it is in the fact that it has a sense of self. And so going back to the smuggler analogy, and this is where we can start to bring it in, one of the objectives that we need to figure out as Jews that we're here is one of our purposes in life is, or perhaps our sole purpose in life, is really to bring God down here into this world. So how do we do that if we're saying that God cannot dwell in a place that is not totally nullified and that is not totally selfless? So how does that happen? So one hint at this is in what we learned about previously when it comes to the mitzvos, when it comes to the different laws that God gave us. So again, I think there's sort of this misconception that when we talk about Jewish law, when we talk about halacha and things like that, it's kind of just this rule book to keep us religious or something in some kind of nice way, and it's kind of like a traditional thing to keep us Jewish or whatever. But the Tanya takes it a lot deeper, and the Tanya explains to us how on a very profound, deep level, the halachas, the laws of the Torah, are actually the manifest will and wisdom of God. And so this is one of the, and it might not feel so comprehensible, because it's not really a logical thing necessarily, but it is a true fact that when it comes to God's will and wisdom, those are unified with him. Those are direct manifestations of who he is, and God, in a miraculous kind of way, being who God is, and God being able to do whatever he's able to do, he was able to constrict his will and wisdom into these laws, so that when we perform these laws, when we do the will of God, and we do the things that God told us to do, we are actually tapping into the essence of who he is via his will and wisdom. So we talked about this previously. This is similar to if you are really thirsty and you ask your spouse or your good friend to go get you a glass of water. If they go and get you that glass of water, well, it might seem like a very mundane act from the outside if somebody just sees somebody going to the kitchen, pouring some water, but there's actually a very deep connection going on, that they are fulfilling a very deep will of you. So now another thing that we have to bring up here is another limitation of the godly soul. What is the limitation of the godly soul in terms of the purpose being to bring godliness and the godly soul and its manifestation down here into the world? Well, the godly soul is entirely spiritual. It's 100% spiritual. It has absolutely nothing physical about it. It has no dimensions. It has no materiality. It doesn't take up any space. It's really, really not physical at all. And then when you look at, the physical world, and specifically our physical bodies, which is where we're supposed to try to manifest our godly soul into, our bodies are entirely physical. We've talked about previously how our bodies really ultimately is just like a hunk of flesh, really, and bones. That's really what our bodies are. So how can we connect these two opposites? Something which is so spiritual, namely the godly soul, and the physical body. And so this is where the smuggling comes in. And this is where hopefully we're going to bring all of this together and understand this. And eventually we will get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all this. So what it is that we're trying to smuggle is godliness. Where are we trying to smuggle it into? We're trying to smuggle it into the physical body. Why do we need to smuggle it specifically? Because again, there's no connection. The physical body is not interested in anything spiritual. The spiritual reality of our godly soul is not interested in anything physical. They have nothing to do with each other. So how do we bridge that gap? Who's going to smuggle these two things? So if you remember, as we've been talking about, we have another soul. We don't just have the godly soul. We have the animal soul. And this is where it can really shine. So the animal soul, as we'll see, is this famous smuggler. The animal soul is the very entity that allows to serve as this intermediary between the godly soul, which is entirely spiritual, and the body, which is entirely physical, because the animal soul is somewhere in between. The animal soul is a soul, like the godly soul, so it is a spiritual thing. On the other hand, it has very much a connection to the body and to physicality, and its drives are not for godly, are not for holy things like that. The will of and the yearning of the animal soul is for physicality, is for eating, for drinking, for sleeping, for going to the bathroom, for engaging in all kinds of physical pleasures. That's what the animal soul enjoys. That's what the animal soul likes to do. But again, if you remember what we've learned in the past in the Tanya, with the analogy of the prostitute and the Zohar, deep down, the animal soul actually also wants to serve God. It also wants to do God's will. And so just like going back to the story of Meir Abasera, how he might appear to the guards as just some like random guy, like some bummy guy who's just bringing rocks over the border or something like that. So that it's meant to look like that. We're meant to have our animal souls appear like that, as these like foolish souls that just want to be very hedonistic and live for pleasure all day long and that kind of thing. But deep down, the will of the animal soul is actually aligned with the godly soul. And this is where it makes it for a very interesting thing, is that if we can just get that animal soul to tap into its ultimate purpose and to its ultimate will, it can actually serve as an incredible smuggler to smuggle the godly soul into the body. And so the way that this works is once again bringing it full circle back to those mitzvos, back to the commandments, to Jewish law, to halacha. Why? Because again, first of all, we talked about how halacha is the direct will of God, right? And it's the direct wisdom of God. So it is not limited by love and fear and that kind of thing, but it's actually has a much more direct connection with God in an unfiltered way. And interestingly enough, and this is how we see it, that it all connects, how do we do God's will? How do we do halacha and those kind of things? It's specifically with the physical body. It's not with the godly soul. It's not just spiritual things. So, lighting Shabbos candles, putting on tefillin, eating kosher, all of these things are physical actions that we need to do. So when we go back and we think about the animal soul, again, what is the function of the animal soul in daily life? Like what does it do exactly? We can think of, how do we define really the animal soul? We can think of it as like the life force of the body. So if you just took a body without any kind of soul in it at all, no godly soul, no animal soul, it really would be a corpse, God forbid. That's what happens when somebody passes away and we say their soul leaves their body. We don't just mean the godly soul, we mean the animal soul as well. There is no soul left. So once you take away all the souls from the bodies, it doesn't move. It doesn't do anything. So the purpose of the animal soul and what the animal soul does inside the body is that is the life force that allows us to move, that allows us to eat, that allows us to drink, that allows us to talk and think and do all of these things. And so when we utilize this power of movement, this power of action that we have within our animal soul to do the will of God, this is the way that we smuggle godliness into this world, because we're doing physical things. So the body's like, oh yeah, I'm familiar with this. This is physicality. This is my realm. This is what I do all the time. I'm eating, I'm talking, I'm doing these things. Meanwhile, they're not just eating and talking. They're eating kosher food. They're saying a bracha. They're learning with their physical mind, learning Torah. And God's ultimate purpose, God's ultimate wish, is to have the godly soul be manifest here in the physical body. However, there are a couple of problems with that. One is the fact that the godly soul is extremely spiritual and the body is highly physical. And the second problem with that is that the godly soul, as great as it is limited in the sense that it's all about feeling God in its spiritual sense of love and fear and all those things that are very particular to the particular soul. And so the way that we circumvent these two things is by bringing in the animal soul, because the animal soul, first of all, serves as this intermediary which connects the two. And it does this through Jewish law, because Jewish law is not limited the way that fear and love of God is limited, because Jewish law is a direct manifestation of God's will. And Jewish law also is something that can only be performed by the physical body down here through the animal soul. So that's the way that God gets smuggled into the world. So I hope I explained this well. I really tried to break it down as best possible. We're going to get into the text now and see how the Alter Rebbe breaks it down and goes through it. And then maybe we'll try to give a little recap at the end. So for context, once again, we're still in the middle of chapter 35 of Likkutei Amarim. And the Alter Rebbe begins by describing what happens to a person's soul when they're involved in learning Torah. So when a person's involved in learning Torah, then this is primarily an occupation of the godly soul, right? Like it's a holy kind of thing to do. And the godly soul has three garments to it. Like we mentioned, the animal soul has three garments and the godly soul has three garments. Thought, speech, and action are the three garments. And the two inner garments are thought and speech, whereas the external garment is action. So when a person is involved in Torah study, there are two inner garments, which is speech and thought, are involved in this, right? Like you're learning Torah and you're thinking about what you're learning, and you're also most probably speaking the words out loud. I mean, that's the way that we're told that we're supposed to learn Torah, is we actually are supposed to mouth the words out loud. So the speech is involved. So that's what happens when we learn Torah. And so at that time, when a person's learning Torah, then indeed these two inner powers of their soul, these two inner garments of their soul, the thought and the speech, actually become subsumed in the light of God and become one with it and unified with it with total unity, which is this dwelling of the Shekhinah that we've been talking about. So the Shekhinah does dwell upon a person and upon their godly soul while they are learning Torah, which is why it's taught, and this is taken from the Gemara in Brachos, page 6a, that even one person who sits and studies Torah, the Shekhinah is with them. So think about that. The next time you are learning Torah by yourself, maybe that's right now while you're learning this Torah, the Shekhinah is actually resting within you because you're involving your thought and maybe you're also involving your speech. So these two garments of your godly soul are actually totally becoming unified with the Shekhinah. It's a pretty cool thing. However, this is not the full story, because if you remember, you don't only have a godly soul, you also have an animal soul, and you also have a body. So what about them? Do we just leave them to dry and forget about them? So the Alter Rebbe addresses this right now, and he says that in order to bring the light of the Shekhinah into one's body and into their animal soul, which is this vivifying soul that is enclosed within the body, a person actually has to do physical mitzvos that are done by the body. Because then the power of the body itself becomes subsumed in this light of God and in this will of God and becomes unified with it with total unity. And this is also the third lavush, the third garment of the godly soul. So remember, we talked about how if a person sits and studies Torah, their inner garments, the first two garments are involved, like the garment of thought and the garment of speech. But the garment of action really only gets activated when a person actually does a physical mitzvah with their physical body. And so then what happens, so when a person actually gets involved in this physical mitzvah, first of all, they're involving this third garment of the godly soul, the garment of action, and then also the power of this vitalizing soul, the otherwise known as the animal soul that's within their body, which actually comes from klipa. Remember we talked about it? It comes from klipas noga. It actually transforms from bad to good and becomes totally subsumed in holiness, just like the godly soul. So we actually are able to, at that moment, when we're doing a mitzvah, to transform the animal soul within us to a godly type of being, where it's so totally unified with God, just like the godly soul is. Because it's actually the animal soul that's doing this mitzvah, because again, we talked about how the animal soul is the vivifying force within the body. So in order to, this is where, the smuggler analogy comes in a little bit, because the godly soul, we'll see, cannot really affect the body directly. It's too spiritual of a being. But the animal soul is this vitalizing force within the body. So the animal soul is what animates the body to do the different mitzvahs. And because the animal soul is the vitalizing force behind the physical action of the mitzvahs, this causes the animal soul to actually become so totally unified with holiness. And this is exactly what the Alter Rebbe says right here, is he says that it's really the animal soul that is the activating force of doing the mitzvah. And without this animal soul, the godly soul would not be able to affect the body at all, because it's totally spiritual and the body is totally physical. And so the intermediary between these two things is this animal soul, which is enclosed within the blood of man, that is in their heart. Remember, and we talked specifically about how it's in the left ventricle of the heart and in the entire body. So that's the end of the section for today. So hopefully this gave you a little bit of an appreciation for the purpose of the animal soul and the value of the animal soul. And we're going to continue along these lines tomorrow when we actually conclude this chapter, when we discuss a little bit more about the relationship between the animal soul and holiness when the animal soul is engaged in a mitzvah. So stay tuned for that, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.